talked about this later in the United Kingdom. They selected those people based on who they wanted. They trained them in some Indonesian sentences like, I agree with Indonesia, I don't want the Dutch. My father didn't know the meaning of these sentences. After some weeks they tested who was doing good. And my father passed the test. He was asked to say one of those whole sentences in a meeting. Historian John Salford claims that the educational techniques were augmented by threats to the delegates because they would be shot if they voted the wrong way. Now, going on to what Ted talks about, and I'll mainly read what Ted's, I'm not reading the whole thing at all, but he wrote a section in this book actually, which was very kind of him. It's the first account which he made actually of being there. Ted was an observer at the actual act of free choice. He says, one of a small party of independent observers of the act of free choice, by which it became, was present at the consultations conducted in 6 of the centres, made possible by the Indonesian government's willingness to allow foreign media to observe and report, and the need for others to help meet the costs in chartering aircraft. Okay. So he came in with 4 or 5 others, I think it was, and as he says, he had the same problem with travel I was just describing before. The plane's not quite making it because of the mountains being a little high or the fuel running out. He said the meetings tended to be quite emotional affairs, with loud singing of Indonesian national anthems and other Indonesian national songs, shouting of pro-industrial Indonesian slogans, vigorous cheering and clapping, etc., 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 etc. The meetings combined diverse elements of national exhortation, the offering of material inducements like khaki uniforms for the men and Indonesian-style clothes for the women. The first meeting, which was held in Merauke, the southeast of the territory, close to the border. The second meeting, on the evening before the meeting, this I'm quoting again from Ted, my companions and I were walking around town when we saw a convoy of official-looking vehicles sweep past and into the compound, with the gates left open. We followed inside and into a building where we witnessed a ceremony which the participants in the following day's proceedings were encouraged to sing, exhorted to remain with Indonesia, and each presented with gifts of a briefcase and tobacco. You don't need a briefcase a lot in the jungle. In Womana, the same thing was happening. They dropped leaflets as well. And the men who were there were normally wearing their yellow penis gourds. They were forced to wear Western Indonesian clothes, but as soon as the Indonesians left, they immediately went back to their traditional clothes. At Manawakari is probably the most interesting of Ted's observations. I walked outside to cool off and look around the stuffingly hot place where the meeting was being held. A young man ran through the crowd shouting, "Sendiri, Sendiri," which I understand means freedom or independence. Being inexperienced in such settings, I moved towards him in order to photograph the occasion. As a group of Indonesians whom I took to be security officers swooped on him and almost dragged him over me. When I looked out to sea, I saw that when I had previously what I thought was previously a ceremonial fleet, it turned around and were training its cannons on the crowd. So that was what it was like. That was what Ted had witnessed. He witnessed the corruption of this whole thing. So at this moment I shall continue. I shall completely finish. This is continuing. This is continuing. This is continuing. And those are the people being killed. Thank you.
Yes. What time are we scheduled to finish?
12:45.
Okay, so we've got just
So you've got 20 minutes.
Okay.
Maybe a bit of time for questions.
Thank you. Okay, so leading on from Stephen, I've been looking at what's behind this, what's allowed this to happen, because we all come under the international law of the United Nations. That's the governing body which tries to keep peace in this world. And in particular, the UN is focused on decolonisation, which is one of the main topics of this conference. And the island of Papua is a classic because you've got one half, the eastern half, which was a colony of Australia and previously before that partly a colony of Germany. And it's gone through the process of being decolonised, first as a non-self-governing territory, then partly as a trust territory, and then getting independence. And yet the western side, the same people, the same cultures, Melanesian people of course, instead somehow have been handed over to an Asian country with the name of Indonesia. So I'll be looking at this for some time and delving into the Charter and delving into now declassified documents of the United Nations, Australia, America, the Dutch, Indonesia. We've come up with a very interesting story. So part one, I'll give you a brief background of how we got to the presentation that Steve has gone through. It's the biggest island of Melanesia. It's the second biggest island in the world, and it's home to several million Melanesian people. It's just off the tip of Australia. Most people don't know it, but from the most northern island in the Australian territory, you can actually wade across the water at low tide to the island of Papua. I would imagine there are still people, particularly in the West Papuan side, which have never had contact with the outside world. Every few decades, they discover new tribes of people living in the jungle in West Papua. Also home to some of the world's most amazing animal species, according to Alfred Russel Wallace. So there's the line. The border was established in 1828 between the Dutch and the Germans. Basically, they had a couple of little outposts on either end of the island, and they decided to put a line down the middle. Of course, it runs through people's villages and tribal grounds and forests and all the rest of it. First contact was missionaries from 1855 in West Papua, and soon after that came European development. It took them about 60 years before they could make a permanent base. The first few attempts, they were wiped out with malaria and various other tribal problems, malaria. Going up to World War II, the West Papuans, along with the people in Papua New Guinea, of course, were allies to Australia and America. And the Oak Tree Party were a famous group that would lure the Japanese into the jungle by themselves, with only a couple of Western, I think one Western guy, the guy sitting in the middle, who was a Dutch fellow that stayed on during the war and refused to leave and worked with the West Papuans. When the Allies came in en masse, they were the bearers that carried the wounded out and carried ammunition to the front line. When America came in 1944, they made Hollandia, the capital of West Papua at that time, their capital, their base for the World War II operations in the Pacific. And there's MacArthur. Okay, so now getting on to the legal aspects of how this unravelled the way it did. The UN came into being in 1945, post-World War II, to try to keep peace. Chapters 11, 12 and 13 are the three chapters concerned with decolonisation. West Papua was under Chapter 1 initially, a non-self-governing territory of the Netherlands. Chapter 11, Article 73E, is a very important article. It is the article that requires countries that have territories to report each year to the United Nations General Assembly on the progress being made towards decolonisation. And the only time you can stop reporting, as it says at the bottom of Part E, is when chapters 12 and 13 apply to that territory. Until that time, you have to report. And chapters 12 and 13, as I mentioned before, is the International Trusteeship System and the Trusteeship Council. So, as we see in 1960, Netherlands New Guinea is on the list of United Nations non-self-governing territories. And this is the last report from the Netherlands to the United Nations in 1961, where they explained to the UN and the General Assembly the progress they're making towards decolonisation. I've highlighted a couple of paragraphs because it shows you how far they've gone. In the first paragraph, it says, it may be said the institution of the New Guinea Council has had a catalytic effect on the political awakening of the population. They have resolved to call themselves Papuans and to refer to their country as West Papua. They have designed their own national flag and they've adopted a national anthem. In the second paragraph, we see a little bit about the system of governance. Moreover, the policy of having the Papuans participate at all other levels of political and social life is being vigorously pursued, as is the further implementation of social decentralisation. They have set up not just a national council, they've also set up regional councils, and within those regional councils, village councils. It's a bottom-up system of political representation, unique to the Melanesian way of life. 1st of December 1961 is the first flag raising in West Papua. Agreed to by the Netherlands, the West Papuan national flag, the Morning Star flag, flew alongside the Dutch flag right across the territory. So we can say the 1st of December 1961, the Netherlands was Netherlands New Guinea was well on the way to following the decolonisation process under chapters 11 of the Charter. Because Australia held the eastern side of the islands and the Netherlands on the western side, they cooperated and they signed a joint agreement in 1957 to coordinate administration with the overall plan to give independence to the entire country so that the people would have the option, if they wanted, to reunite with their friends and their cousins, and as you can imagine, that line would go right through some people's villages, so it's quite a ridiculous concept. And it says that they respect the inalienable rights of the inhabitants, they recognise the ethnological and geographical affinity, and they agree to coordinate their administrations. Soon after this, Indonesia started sending over military, small military incursions, usually no more than 100 people. The main idea was to upset the Dutch and to try to provoke the Dutch, as we understand it. We see in 1963 that in the list of non-self-governing territories, which is here in front of us, the Netherlands has been removed. So the agreement, which came into being in 1962, transferring administration from the Netherlands to the United Nations, changed the legal status. That's the important aspect. It changed the legal status of that colony of Netherlands, New Guinea. That's chapter 11 again, just reminding us that they must report until such time as chapter 12 and 13 become applicable. Chapter 12 is concerned with the international trusteeship system. And what that does is when you transfer a territory, usually to the United Nations, it becomes what's called a trust territory. And rather than the Netherlands reporting under Article 73E to the General Assembly, it's now the Trusteeship Council, which is a principal organ of the United Nations. It has to set up a questionnaire and assist with the terms of the agreement, of trust agreements, and it then reports to the General Assembly on the progress being made. And Article 76 advances the demands of decolonisation. It goes from having to report on the progress to having to report towards self-government or independence. That's the key two words, self-government or independence. There's no option to transfer sovereignty to another country. At that time also, the General Assembly, while resolutions are not legal law, international law, they are reflections of the concern that the United Nations members have in the system of decolonisation. And so Resolution 1514 states, immediate steps shall be taken in trust and non-self-governing territories or all other territories which may be considered towards giving the people complete independence and freedom. Again, no option to transfer sovereignty. Here's the agreement. The agreement in the initial phase transfers administration from the Netherlands to the United Nations. While the agreement is titled Agreement between Indonesia and the Netherlands, the administration, the control, is transferred to the United Nations. Article 12, deep into the agreement, gives the United Nations only the discretion to transfer all or part of administration to Indonesia. So the United Nations is the first body to take control of administration. Article, 18 is the method in which self-determination is going to be provided. And as we can see there, the question is whether to remain with Indonesia or whether they wish to sever their ties with Indonesia. And the legal aspect is that it's not in compliance with self-government or independence or complete independence and freedom as required under 1514 and the Charter. So, what I'm advancing is that the agreement between the Netherlands and Indonesia transformed West Papua from a non-self-governing territory of the Netherlands to a trust territory of the United Nations. And as such, it is still a trust territory. Okay, so now I'm going to go on to what we have discovered in declassified documents from the period. This is an American document from 1959. It's the first record that we can find discussing the issue. And what they're saying, that America's interests are they best served by our present policy towards West New Guinea? Or would these interests be served by a change in policy? And what they're advancing in point 4, to have the prospect of success, any solution must contain provision for eventual relinquishment of Dutch control over West New Guinea and the eventual attainment of at least partial control by the Indonesian government. These are all declassified files which you can find on the American Department of State website. Another one here. Now they're advancing a formula. In summary, a two-part formula envisages one, a special United Nations trusteeship, and that's the key word, trusteeship. They recognise that a transfer of administration creates a trusteeship territory. This is a paper that was written for the President at that time, John F. Kennedy, and this document is from the archives of the John F. Kennedy website. It says, this is the option 4 that they're putting to the President. A trusteeship which was terminated at a definite or early date by a self-determination plebiscite would be a somewhat more feasible alternative. It would provide a face-saving approach for the Dutch and satisfy the demand for self-determination by the Papuans. At the same time, if the Indonesians were given full access to the Papuans during the period of the trusteeship, it would offer them the hope of early acquisition of the territory. The arrangement of such a trusteeship would be likely to involve long and arduous negotiations. In the process of negotiation, the direct political gains to the US in the relations would likely be somewhat attenuated. On the other hand, some version of such an approach may offer the best facade behind which a turnover to the Indonesians could be effected. So this is the exact formula which played out only 1 year later. So we know it's an American facade to transfer the territory to Indonesia. This is an Australian document from the time, 1962, and it's a memo to the government, and it says, the ambassador approached me as I was about to sit down at an official luncheon to ask whether we had taken steps to express to the Americans our disapproval of a trusteeship proposal attributed to them, a step which the ambassador had asked Sir Garfield Barwick to take to Mr. Luns. Mr. Luns was the Prime Minister of Holland, and Sir Garfield Barwick at the time was our Attorney General and Minister for External Affairs. And just on the side, Sir Garfield Barwick also went on to be a judge with the International Court of Justice. So there's the evidence that Australian government knew all about it. They knew about the facade. They knew about the trusteeship. And what's more, the United Nations International Court of Justice also knew about this illegal transfer. Another declassified document, a CIA report from 1962. In that report, we discover that the Americans are in secret discussion with Secretary General, the United Nations Secretary General Utant is in discussions with General Sukarno, and he's reassuring General Sukarno that the Netherlands is willing to postpone a plebiscite until after Indonesia takes control. So you can see this is a covert operation that has been orchestrated from 1959 up until 1962 to illegally transfer control to Indonesia. This is the General Assembly plenary meeting of 11/27, Friday 21. This is when the agreement was noted, that's an important word, noted by the General Assembly. And what we see is that the President is stifling debate. He says, in order to enable, and I might just go back one slide and just say that first of all, plenary meeting started at 3 p.m. on a Friday. And agenda item number 89 is some 7 pages through in discussions. So there's been probably at least an hour of discussions before agenda item 89 concerning the agreement comes up. So it's Friday afternoon, 4 o'clock, 5 o'clock, everybody wants to go home. And this is where they've put the agenda item. And I'll read it out. In order to enable General Assembly to deal with this matter expeditiously, I propose to call first on the sponsors, and then, if the General Assembly agrees, to proceed to the vote. So there was no discussion. The whole point of the General Assembly is to discuss things, to debate things, and then go to a vote. But this was rushed through without debate. And it was carried. But it wasn't carried, it was only noted. That's the important aspect. These trusteeship agreements, I didn't show you the actual article, but they have to be agreed upon by the General Assembly. They can't be noted. So the fact that it was noted is an important legal aspect. So here we are, the 1st of October 1962, and this is Ortiz Sands in the middle in the white suit. He's arriving to take control of West Papua, or Netherlands, New Guinea. During the United Nations administration, which went from the 1st of October until the 1st of May 1973, only a very short period, but during that time there were ongoing protests, as Stephen explained earlier. Now remembering that the United Nations had only the discretion to transfer the territory to Indonesia, and ultimately at the root of the whole issue is the welfare of the inhabitants, the welfare of the West Papuan people. That's what the Charter is concerned about, making sure that welfare of the West Papuan people is meeting their wishes and their desires. It was reported, but not a great deal. Okay, Indonesia came in on the 1st of May 1973. The Dutch left on the very same day. Sorry, the United Nations. 63, what did I say?
73.
Oh, sorry. There were ongoing arrests, murders, and on 65, the OPM declares independence and commences their guerrilla war, as Stephen detailed earlier. A few reports got out about the mass murder occurring inside West Papua. And even before the Act of Free Choice, as it was called, which occurred in 1969, the American company Freeport-McMoran was already heavy lifting in its mining equipment to start mining the lucrative Grasberg deposit that we saw before. So even before it was legally occupied and run by the Indonesians, America was in mining gold. This is my favourite document. This is a 1969 document by Frank Galbraith, a very big family of people that work in the State Department and the American office. Still today, the Galbraith, a fellow called Peter Galbraith, ran East Timor when I was in East Timor. And if you can read this, it gives you, this is a secret intelligence report detailing the situation in West Papua when the Indonesians came in and just before the vote. So the Americans knew full well that 85 to 90% of the population hated the Indonesians, wanted nothing to do with them. They knew the Indonesians just raped and pillaged and looted when they arrived. They knew that they were trigger happy and just shot people indiscriminately. This is in the New York Times, 1969, where Indonesian officials openly admit that the Act of Free Choice is a done deal and that the people are in open revolt. Another declassified document from '69, and we see here they're calling it like a Greek tragedy unfolding before them. The conclusion preordained. And they also state in the second paragraph that the loss of West Papua would give impetus for other parts of Indonesia where anti-Java feelings run strong. So I didn't go through it in any detail, but 5 minutes. But Indonesia was created post-65, after the Charter was formed, and it was only recognised in 1949. So all those territories, which were non-self-governing territories under the Dutch, were forcefully amalgamated under the Indonesian dictatorship. So they have a claim, I believe, to self-determination to this day. This is Resolution 2504. As I mentioned, it only takes note of the report. If we go to the PGA handbook, which guides us the interpretation of the General Assembly, we see that take note does not indicate approval. This is a method, a way out in which this can be addressed. Under the rules of procedure of the Trusteeship Council, any member can put this issue on the agenda and raise the concerns about the breach of law under the international trusteeship system. Also, Rule 77 allows petitions to be presented if they concern the operation of the international trusteeship system. So we can put a petition, anybody can put a petition and draw attention to this breach. Resolution 2621. This is a resolution from the General Assembly, which came into being in 1970, and it was really reflecting the fact that there are still a lot of non-self-governing territories and trust territories which don't have independence, and it's about time it happened. And what they're saying is, members shall render all necessary material assistance to those people to help, which means any member can go and help New Caledonia, West Papua, any other territory which does not enjoy complete independence and freedom. It's been well documented by Sydney University, Yale University, Cami and Jim. Cami unfortunately can't be here today, about the ongoing genocide in West Papua. And one of the worst situations is where they're taking young children, as young as 5, in military aircraft to Java and putting them behind bars in Islamic schools and forcing them under Islam. Once they grow up, they're returned, and this process continues and continues and continues. There's a massive Islamization going on of West Papua. I've worked all over the world as a geologist, a resource geologist. I worked for BHP in West Africa, and from my estimation, there would be approximately $3 trillion of minerals have been extracted from West Papua. It's the largest gold mine and copper mine in the world. Finally, what does it tell us? Well, Indonesian sovereignty over West Papua has never been acknowledged by the United Nations. There's never been a resolution recognising sovereignty. America is revealed as the puppeteer of the transfer. The occupation of West Papua and slow-motion genocide is illegal and an international crime under the Charter. The United Nations Secretariat, America, Australia, the Netherlands and Indonesia are all guilty of conspiracy and a legal path. There are several paths available for redress through the Trusteeship Council, the General Assembly and the Economic and Social Council, but the method that I explained through the rules of procedure of the Trusteeship Council are the more readily available rules and method for addressing this issue. And finally, the West Papuan people have the legitimate right to fight for freedom, and the international community is obliged to assist by all necessary means. Please help West Papua.
Thanks to Julian and Stephen earlier, and a few minutes for questions. Any questions, Rowena?
It's really interesting as a legal analysis, and that is really important. But I've always wondered why, except for the fact that it was access to resources and things like that, why Indonesia was so determined to take West Papua. And the only thing that I've ever been able to consider is that the Indonesian elite considered West Papua to be part of the former Dutch
East Indies.
East Indies, and as such, they felt that the right to make Indonesia, West Papua to be part of Indonesia. Would you consider that an appropriate way in terms of Indonesian response?
Yes, there's 2 reasons why Indonesia was so keen to have it. First of all, Sukarno had an obsession.
Yeah.
I didn't show the documents. I've got thousands of these declassified documents, but in one of them, it shows that Sukarno, this is in the words of the Australian intelligence at the time, they're saying that Sukarno is obsessed with wanting the entire archipelago. He's a dictator. He's a military dictator. He tried to invade Malaya and take over British Malaya. That was unsuccessful, so he turned his attention to taking over West Papua. The other reason is they were very, very scared about successionist movements, because remember, from 45 until 49, I didn't show this either, but they had over 1,000 Japanese defectors that preferred to stay in Indonesia, marry Japanese girls, learn the language, change their name to Muslim names, rather than go back to Japan and face war crimes and whatever else might occur. So they had all the military hardware of Japan in their hands, which they didn't have before. So using the Japanese, who trained up all the local Javanese, they were able to go from island to island to island and create what was initially the United States of Indonesia. That was how it entered the United Nations, as the United States of Indonesia, where each of those non-self-governing territories had a degree of autonomy, just as the United States of America did initially. But once Sukarno got recognition, he immediately changed the name to the Republic of Indonesia and made it a dictatorship. So he had an obsession with the issue, and also he didn't want West Papua to break away, because that would then give the impetus for Borneo, Kalimantan, Sumatra, Bali to break away as well.
It was carried through to his daughter, Megawati Sukarno Putri, too, who became president. That was her main thing. Indonesia's, the vision of her father, to maintain the integrity of the country.
In terms of the timing of all this, I mean, we are talking, and particularly in the late 50s, early 60s, if we look at the geopolitical work in terms of Malaysia, Singapore, the internal issues in Indonesia, including Sukarno, the eventual fall of Sukarno, I can very much see the involvement in the United States. It's very, very clear for other reasons. But what I never, on top of not understanding why Indonesia wanted West Papua, except for the fact that it was from what the Dutch were doing. Because I mean, I don't know. I just can't understand why the Dutch must have been very understood what was going to happen.
Yeah, they were very, very afraid to see Indonesia take over. That's why they were so keen. See, back in 1961, they put a proposal to the United Nations in the General Assembly to take over West Papua as a proper trust territory, as they did anyway. But it was rejected, because you've got to get 2/3 of the vote through the General Assembly. Yeah. And because of the Cold War, Indonesia was able to get the Russian support and all the other Russian-aligned countries. And because Indonesia was a Muslim country, all the Muslim countries backed Indonesia. So they put religious and Cold War issues before human rights. So they tried to do the right thing, the Dutch, all the way through. As we saw with the agreement with Australia, they were preparing to make the island independent together. It's a very sad state of affairs.
I have from the chair, may I have a question? So the current state of play, if I understood you right, is that the arms struggle is not as prominent as an international political issue struggle. Are you seeing any sort of parallels with the Timorese diplomatic offensive that occurred?
Very much. Okay. Yeah. East Timor is a little bit different in that East Timor was a direct invasion. It was a Portuguese colony, a non-self-governing territory, and Indonesia simply invaded and took over. As you may recall, you had Henry Kissinger and Gerald Ford, the president, arrived in Jakarta the night of the invasion, and the following day they invaded. In the case of West Papua, it was a legal transfer to the United Nations, which created the trust territory, as we've seen through the United Nations Charter, which is international law, and then the United Nations transferred administration at its discretion to Indonesia, which they can do. However, you can't transfer sovereignty. The people are still legally bound to receive complete independence and freedom under Resolution 1514, or self-governance and independence under Chapter 12 of the trusteeship system. So it's similar in that it's an illegal occupation.
But in terms of the now international diplomatic effort, is how strong is that feeling? I know there were votes in the General Assembly about Timor. Have there been votes in the General Assembly about West Papua?
No. The problem is really that we've had countries like Tuvalu, Vanuatu especially, and the Solomons have been speaking in the General Assembly, raising the issue about self-determination and human rights, but they haven't followed the legal path.
Okay.
It's a legal issue now.
Yeah.
We can talk about human rights, we can talk about the suffering of the West Papuan people, but in order to get it through to the International Court of Justice for a legal opinion, We have to follow one of these paths.
There is some action through the Melanesian spearhead.
Well, I was going to say, I mean,
Yeah.
they're an observer,
Exactly.
or sorry, Indonesia's also an observer.
I know.
Yeah.
But that's the only action really
Yes,
had
but
in the international.
but it has no standing.
No,
the,
it has no
the
standing.
Pacific Island Forum or the Melanesian Spearhead Group have no legal standing in the UN. They're just a regional body.
Further questions? Anyone? Okay. Well, thank our two speakers, Stephen and Julian, and invite you to partake in